Good evening, everybody. With the time being 7:39, I would like to call the Government Operations Committee to order. Roll call, please.
Silkaitis.
Here.
Folks.
Here.
Bungard.
Here.
Munns.
Here.
Lencioni.
Here.
Gem. Petrilla.
Here.
Wirbal.
Here.
Bessner.
Here.
Weber.
Here. Thank you very much. We have a quorum. First up, I need a motion and a second for the omnibus vote.
So moved.
Moved by Munn, seconded by Lencioni. Roll call, please.
Silkaitis.
Yes.
Folks.
Yes.
Bungard.
Yes.
Munns.
Yes.
Lencioni.
Yes.
Petrilla.
Yes.
Wirbal.
Yes.
Bessner.
Yes. All righty. Thank you very much. First up, we have Bill Hanna with item 5C. He's going to give us an overview of the 2025-2026 draft budget. Go ahead, Mr. Hanna. You have the floor.
Okay. Thank you, Chair Weber. Thank you, members of the committee. Tonight is a presentation of an overview of the draft budget for fiscal year 25-26. This is a continuation of some of the discussions that we had back on January 27th at the budget workshop. So as always, if there's any questions, please feel free to reach out during the presentation or at the end. I just wanted to mention a few sort of housekeeping items related to the draft budget. This is the third year that the city has created a full draft budget document. This is something that was begun back in 2022. So in addition to that, we've also done a lot of improvements, and we continue to do that to the draft budget document to try and increase transparency and understanding of the draft budget document consistent with the city's strategic priority of community engagement. We're also making, as we've discussed in the past, some improvements for the city budget document to potentially be eligible for the GFOA budget award. The last time that was submitted to GFOA by the city was 2005. So those are some things that we're looking to do as we continue this process of making the budget document clear to understand. We've also consolidated some accounting units. The big thing this year was we consolidated a lot of accounting units related to, we had separate units for clerk and treasurer and all these different, elected officials. So we have one accounting unit for all city officials combined, in addition to actually having accounts illustrating the outside funding that goes to outside groups within that budget. So it's a lot easier to find, where a lot of that information before was in a lot of disparate sections of the budget and wasn't really clear. So just another thing we did kind of this year to keep up and kind of keep pace with some of those efforts that we're making. We've also added links to the city's strategic plan within the various departments, where those goals and objectives of the various departments coincide with the overall strategic plan goals of the city. Lastly, we will have the budget on the agenda for April 7th at committee in case there's any follow-up questions or discussions. And then the official public hearing for the city budget and approval will be on April 21st. So, and happy St. Patrick's Day to the little logo I put up there. So overall, these are the summary, sort of, I call key takeaways with the city's draft budget. If I had to summarize everything down, and we'll expand on this a little bit more going forward, but this kind of highlights some of the highlights that we're talking about tonight. One, the general fund operating budget is balanced with roughly $64.8 million in revenues or transfers in, as well as expenditures or transfers out. One thing to note in this year's general fund is that there are no additional budgeted transfers to the capital projects fund next year or additional transfers to the water fund, but as we'll talk about later, we are recommending increases in those transfers in the current year to help fund some of those things and capital projects that need to get done next year. The core capital projects moving forward next year include $8.3 million for roads, as this has been talked about, and about $3.2 million other capital projects, and we'll hit the highlights on some of those a little bit later on. There are other projects that are being held off for funding at this time, and we'll discuss and go through the highlights of some of those later too. As we talked about at the workshop, some of the key water and sewer capital projects that have been discussed, specifically the Well 8 capacity expansion project and the sewer trunk main project, those projects are moving forward in next year's budget. the well 8 capacity through application for an IEPA low-interest loan, and the sewer trunk main project, Phase 2B that we call it, moving forward with the $8.5 million interfund loan within the city funds. Just a couple notes, leadline service replacements, those are budgeted for a minimal amount this upcoming year, but as we've discussed, that obligation increases to $8 million in the subsequent year. Overall, as we've discussed in the past too, operating and debt service expenditures have limited resources available for capital in the water and sewer funds. So we have made some reductions, primarily associated with water main replacement and various sewer projects. And as we talked about at the workshop, we are looking to have that rate study following now that the master plans for each utility have been completed. So that's the key summary and takeaways. Overall, next year, the city total revenues is $222.9 million, to just shade under $223 million, with expenditures of $221.2 million. This includes a lot of interfund transfer activity between the funds as well. This includes all the funds we budget for, including the pension funds for police and fire, so sometimes that activity skews the numbers a little bit, but we are, although it looks like revenues and expenditure activity in total are about equal, we do have using some of our reserve funds and other funds to advance certain capital projects. The general funds are a major operating fund, and as we discussed, this fund as presented is balanced for next year, with revenues exceeding expenditures by $27,000. This includes interfund transfer activity. Core operating costs for services, as we discussed at the workshop, those are not really keeping pace with our net revenue increases as we're budgeting them for next year. And we don't have the one-time revenue sources to rely on that we had in the past for some of those additional transfers that we talked about. So within the forecasted numbers in the 24-25 column, we are recommending an increase in the transfer from the general fund to the water fund from $1 million to $2.25 million, and for the capital fund from $1.2 million to $2.5 million. Again, that would help front fund some of those projects and various other things for next fiscal year, especially since we can't accommodate those transfers on the front end of next year's budget. Yes?
I don't want to jump ahead. And if I'm cutting you off,
that's okay.
I'll be quiet. Are you going to go into more detail about the services that are outpacing the revenue?
Yeah, well,
are you going to go into detail as to what those services are that are starting out?
Sure, I think, and I think one of my notes as I was going through some of this, it's really the revenues not keeping pace with some of the core operating service costs we have. So we'll have a little bit more detail to talk about those.
Like what specifically those services are?
Yeah, personnel costs, core operating services, yep.
Okay.
So we are recommending a moderate use as projected as forecasted with this budget of $1.3 million in reserves in the current forecasted year. That would draw our fund reserve down to $28.4 million, which we're comfortable doing, given that leaves a fund balance reserve of 43.8%, which we stay within that target that we've talked about previously, but we're still maintaining strong overall fiscal health in the general fund. So we've seen these pie chart presentations before, just wanted to update them with the actual draft budget numbers. Not a lot has changed. Sales tax revenue is still our primary revenue source for general fund, and use taxes at 47%. Property taxes represent 24% of our overall revenues. Again, as we've talked, that property taxes don't fluctuate like some other tax revenues do, so they're really core revenue source to help us maintain that structural balance that we're trying to maintain in our general fund. Intergovernmental revenues, that's primarily our LGDF income tax revenue and still comprises roughly 11% of all revenues. And then we're still maintaining roughly 51% of our total expenditures, 52% related to public safety, 19% public works, and the remaining percentages for various city hall services. So this chart, as the budget presents 4 years of detailed information, so this presents some of the highlights of that detailed information for general fund revenues. And you can see the property tax increases here over for last 2 actual years, forecasted and budget. We discussed sales tax revenue at the workshop and slightly adjusted our forecasted numbers at the time based on just some additional information. So we're still forecasting, projecting sales tax increases for next fiscal year for both our 1% net as well as our home real sales tax. Our state income tax revenue is budgeted at $5.9 million. It does not appear that the state is looking to reduce LGDF funding for next fiscal year, so we're comfortable budgeting at that level for next year. Alcohol tax revenue continues to increase due to some new businesses and increases in sales, so we're continuing to budget that revenue source for increasing, as well as hotel tax. Hotel tax has continued to increase very strong in this current forecasted year, I think roughly 15 to 20%. So we're comfortable that those increases are going to be sustainable going forward in next budget year. One revenue source we wanted to add at the end was what we call what I call the cutting the cord revenue sources, such as our telecommunications tax, cable franchise fees. 3 different types of revenue sources that we kind of lumped in one, but we've seen sort of steady decreases in those revenue sources over the last few years for obvious reasons, and just wanted to highlight it as one of the areas where we are seeing some decreases in revenues, pretty consistently. And while it might not be a big number in terms of the whole percentage of the budget, those things do add up, over time in the big picture. It's not necessarily the revenues that we are losing. It's not having any increases in those revenues in terms of having an impact on what our structural budget looks like going forward. I don't have it here, but same thing on income tax. Not income tax. Our investment income. We've been able to see a lot of additional investment income over the last couple of years, but we are starting to forecast and project that to go down a little bit as interest rates tend to go down. So again, just another revenue source where the net decrease in some of those things can be cumulative and kind of impact how we're staying up to date structurally. This slide is very similar to what was presented at the workshop. This is just the total FTE staffing for the city for the upcoming fiscal year. We talked about the changes with the water and sewer operations and some of the minor increases in hours or conversions of certain positions. So overall, the total FTEs for the city are at 285.9, and you can see the breakdown there by department and fund. This is very similar, again, to what we discussed in January in terms of the CBA wage contract increases that have been taken into account in developing some of the numbers. That includes the wage adjustments listed here, as well as step increases in certain cases. We have our non-union market and merit pool adjustments. And just a quick note at the bottom, too, in terms of general funds, personnel, human resources, and services is roughly 67% of our total general fund budget. And based on the cost increases that we are really committed to, overall, we're seeing those increase by $2.2 million over the prior year budget, or roughly a 5.3% increase. Breaking that down a little bit further, about $1.3 million is in wages and salaries, or roughly a 5.7% increase. And as been discussed, we are looking at some increases in health insurance costs for next year, and that's roughly 10% compared to last year. We are looking and have been having discussions that we may be seeing a continued pace of health insurance cost increases overall over the next couple of years. So again, another one of those cost drivers that, is driving the overall personnel and operating costs to be greater than kind of our revenue increases. So this gives that 4-year outlook similar to revenues in the general fund for all of our operating departments. Not going to spend a lot of time on these, but this is probably pretty close overall to a, I guess what I would call a status quo budget that we've had in the last several years. Heather and I met with each department and looked at various areas to reduce certain proposals or projects or reallocate budgets to other areas or hold off on certain things pending what may be happening revenue-wise in the future. So I appreciate everyone's cooperation with that, and so we did make some reductions during development of this budget. So overall, the increases are primarily weighted to wages and benefits for providing services. One of the areas that you mentioned, and Alderman Bongard, regarding certain cost increases, we have seen some cost increases in terms of street maintenance costs, pavement, patching, crack filling. A lot of those things are going up in cost, and landscaping and various other areas as well. That's why you see a slightly larger increase on the public works services side, going from 11.5 to 12.5 versus forecast, as well as just having some vacancies in the forecasted year. And there's some variances in terms of, one-time expenditures for police in 23-24. That's what led to the decrease in expenditures for 24-25. So there's a couple of little anomalies there, but overall, pretty much a very, very close to status quo budget for next year. So shifting to capital projects, the following is just kind of a high level of the more significant capital projects in the city's general capital fund. Again, this is not related or to any of the utilities at all, just general capital. A road program next year for 2025, roughly $9.5 million. This includes the $500,000 grant the city is receiving through STP for the Prairie Street resurfacing project. We did add from the water fund to the capital fund the water-related infrastructure costs associated with the road program for this year. So in order to make sure the road program could get bid and funded as presented, we shifted that cost to the capital project fund in order to give a little relief on the water fund side. That's something we may have to have future conversations about in the future as the city develops its planned road improvements for upcoming years, and more utility costs associated underground with some of those road improvements need to be considered. So there's a list of other, projects that are in the budget this year related to IT, alley resurfacing. I'm not going to read each one of those off. But First Street Garage, L&M Mid-Block Crossing, council meeting room renovations, and the East Salt Dome roof replacement project. So this slide basically just takes a snapshot of exactly how it looks in the budget. So just wanted to kind of walk down from the top there for our capital projects fund, and some of those projects that we just talked about, they're all incorporated into this $12.4 million number down at the bottom for capital. So trying to tie those different projects we were talking about and how they look in the budget. Our sales tax revenue for the capital projects fund, that home real sales tax, we're looking at that increasing, which is good. Just under $5 million is our budget for next year. We have intergovernmental grant revenue and some reimbursement costs for different other types of revenue coming in, so roughly $7.2 million total. And roughly, like I said, $12.3 million in capital projects. I mentioned that recommended transfer from general fund increasing to $2.5 million. We're recommending doing that, obviously, to try and get some of those capital projects done this upcoming fiscal year. Our reserve at the end of the year is just shy over $3 million at the end of next fiscal year. We want to maintain a reserve in that fund for cash flow purposes, unanticipated needs, and if we have any projects come up where we're able to get grant funding for it, we want to have the resources and flexibility to be able to do that. So we'd ideally like that number to be a little bit higher than that, but in order to, get some things accomplished in this upcoming year. we're comfortable presenting it like that. So this slide illustrates, I think at the workshop we talked about a lot of different capital projects that were under consideration. So on the left, in terms of capital projects held off, these are projects that we discussed but just didn't really identify a funding source for those in the upcoming year. Those include continued design services for Indiana Bridge, improvements related to State Street and the State Street Creek, $1.7 million. Implementation of the sidewalk gap program. The study is done, but this would just delay actually implementing some of those improvements to a future year. And some other capital projects, some of these we mentioned being discussed at the time of the workshop for the roof replacement, parking garage counters, some IT projects, and a couple other projects development. I think that got cut off, but costs related to developing an IT strategic plan, I think we're going to rope that into a general update of the city's strategic plan next fiscal year. And we just listed off the other column. These are other just larger projects that are just out there, maybe not for next fiscal year, but maybe a year or two or three beyond that. So we wanted to kind of provide a full context in terms of here are the other things out there that we're taking into consideration that we need to identify funding for in a future year that may be impacting what we can fund this year in terms of planning. And so some of the things we talked about there are various bike and ped improvements, possibly leverage with grant opportunities, replacement of the rehabilitation of the Red Gate Bridge railings that was discussed recently at services, ongoing road improvements in our road program, 7th Avenue Creek improvements, and just various other capital projects. Just a couple of quick notes on our special revenue capital funds. We talked about these at the workshop. So TIF 3 is essentially closed. We made our final distribution to Kane County, and they're distributed the $824,000 remaining funds in that TIF district. The First Street TIF extension was approved by the state, so that TIF district will continue to contribute its funds towards the First Street debt service obligations. And you can see the other financial activity for the remaining TIFs, including Pheasant Run, which was talked about at P&D last Monday. We did receive $350,000 in that TIF fund, Pheasant Run, for this current fiscal year, and anticipate that increasing for next year. There's a couple of minor projects with the First Street Plaza Fund, including the IDOT work and the modifications to the screening wall. Once those projects are funded and completed out of the First Street Plaza Fund, then we would close that fund into the general fund for whatever remaining funds remain at the end of the year. And as a reminder, we have 4 internal service funds that we use to allocate costs to various departments via transfers and chargebacks. So we have an inventory fund, garage vehicle maintenance and replacement fund, workers' comp liability fund, and fiber communications fund. So those revenues and those funds are essentially funded by other city departments and budgets, and the funds here are accumulated and used to pay out expenditures related to those activities. So I want to switch to the utilities, and starting with our electric fund. Obviously the largest source of revenue for the electric fund is user charges. As talked about, we haven't had a rate increase since 2019. Overall, the fund is in excellent financial shape. Roughly $70 million budgeted next year in revenues, and roughly $68 million in operations, contractual services related to power purchases, and sort of maintenance capital projects and capital projects related to developer improvements or other improvements the city needs to make. And those are primarily funded through reimbursements from other projects, which is an offsetting revenue. So like I said, overall, the fund is in good financial standing, ending the year with roughly $58 million financial reserve. Shifting to the water fund, again, the water fund primarily funded by user charges. Those are projected to increase to $10.2 million next year due to the 5% rate increases that were previously approved. Overall, the water fund essentially is funded with about $11 million in dedicated revenues every year. Roughly, if you add up personnel services, materials and supplies, contractual services, other operating and debt service costs, that eats up roughly $9 million of the total $11 million that we do receive. It only leaves about $2 million per year for capital on a cash basis. So we have to, come up with ways of financing certain things, and we've been trying to do that through the interfund transfers and sort of, prioritizing certain capital projects. We do have budgeted for next year $8.9 million in bond IEPA proceeds. So as we mentioned before, that's the projected revenue coming in from IEPA loans to fund the Well Lake capacity improvement project. That project cost roughly the same dollar amount is budgeted in the capital line item there of $11.7 million. As you can also see here on the interfund transfer side, we budgeted $1.35 million in total coming into the water fund, and based on the recommended increase in the general fund subsidy to the water fund next year, we're recommending that go to $2.6 million, and you can see that reflected in that forecast column. But as we talked about, we don't have the capacity right now to budget for an additional subsidy from the general fund next year to the water fund.
I just want to jump in and emphasize what Bill said. So we've got $2 million basically every single year that we have for all of those water projects that were listed. We have been supplementing that with general fund, but as we've been talking about our general fund costs increasing through contractual agreements, things that we cannot keep lower, that leaves no money left in the general fund to continue to subsidize our water fund. So as our projects mount and we continue to have things like lead service lines coming on board, we're going to have to keep coming up with additional revenue sources or a rate structure to support the capital projects that are needed, because $2 million is not going to be sufficient for that every year.
So similar when we talked about the capital projects fund earlier, this outlines, some of the major projects or other items to note with the water budget for next fiscal year. We are having increases in budgets related to water main distribution repairs. We've talked about that at probably 2 or 3 different meetings, going back to last year's workshop. We do have the Well Lake capacity expansion project budgeted for next year, roughly $8.9 million. And we do have other infrastructure projects related to future well development and some other maintenance items and capital water main replacement associated with the road project. As we talked about at the workshop, there is a significant amount of water main replacement that needs to happen. I think there's probably $46 million of probably maybe a little bit low in terms of estimating what we need to do on an annual basis. And we also have roughly, beginning next year after this coming fiscal year, roughly $8 million with lead line services. So in total, that's roughly $12 to $14 million in total capital outlays that we need to start making, not this upcoming fiscal year, but next fiscal year. So as part of that process of going through things, we did identify certain water projects to hold off on this upcoming year, roughly $4.8 million. 3 of those are some water main replacement projects on 12th, 6th, and 7th Street. We did reduce water meter replacements by about $250,000 due to the amount that we do have inventory right now, and as we're getting through the process of trying to figure out the implementation plans for those, that item was reduced for next year. The tank reservoir 3-4 project, that actually was pushed out a year ago, and that's another project that was pushed out for this upcoming fiscal year. So moving to the sewer fund, again, sewer fund roughly funded with mostly user charges, $13.3 million for next fiscal year. That incorporates the 5% rate increase previously approved. Similar to the water fund, sewer fund is roughly $14 million in ongoing revenues, and roughly $11 million in ongoing expenditures for operations, contractual services, allocations, and debt service. Debt service is a little heavier in sewer fund than in the water fund, just based on the number of loan projects. Most recent one being the Riverside Lift Station, so roughly $4.7 million next year in total debt service outlays. As we talked about previously mentioned, we are looking to fund that next phase of the sanitary sewer trunk main project. That's roughly an $8.46 million project, and that resources coming in is funded through an interfund loan. We're making that interfund loan from the electric fund, and the cost for that trunk main project is within that capital line item of $12.6 million. So of that $12.6 million in capital, roughly $8.4 million is just related to the trunk main project being funded with an interfund loan from our electric fund. Again, as I mentioned previously, that's also known as Trunk Main Phase 2B, funding that with a loan from the electric fund. We would structure a repayment over time, and that would just be part of the analysis that we do with the rate study. There are a few additional phases with that project, obviously, that have been talked about. Phase 2A, we're actually doing Phase 2B first and then Phase 2A, and there's a much larger phase closer to the river that's called Phase 3 that are also in the planning phases, and then would be under for discussion about how to move forward with those in the future. There was roughly $2 million in sewer-related items that we held off on in the upcoming year, just to make sure that the sewer fund had some sort of minimal reserve and adequate reserve to deal with unexpected things in the upcoming fiscal year. So that is the end of the overview tonight. As I mentioned before, it's been a little bit of a challenging process, but I think we came to a pretty good place overall. I appreciate all the departments helping out and Heather's help with this over the year. We are planning on having follow-up discussion at the April 7th meeting, and Heather, I don't know if you want to say.
I think Bill did a good job of emphasizing that each department director really did make an effort to reduce their budgets, things that were not critical to operations as we continue to incur additional costs, just like the inflation in the economy is going. So everybody was really reducing and prioritizing the projects that needed to go to keep our critical operations going. So we did take a very fine look at everything that was going on, and I think that the projects that were detailed in this presentation tonight show you some of the things that were deferred either by necessity or because we knew that it wasn't something that was critical to those operations. So we're happy to answer any questions, but always available as well outside of these meetings to answer any questions.
I'll start with Ryan first. Did you get the answer you needed, Mr. Bongard? Did you want to dig into it anymore?
There's a lot there.
You want to take a pass?
I'll just, a quick one. Why didn't previous committee, I mean, 7 of us are new in the last 4 years, but why didn't they do a draft budget in previous years? I know this is before, but what was maybe, can you walk us through what the process was before?
Yeah, give us some history on the draft budget, because this is great, but it should reflect.
Sure. I think the way the city approached the discussions and the meetings was the workshop was typically held towards, I believe, the end of February, and that's where some of the information would be discussed, kind of the big picture information, and I believe there might have been an additional presentation on various steps of where the city is at with the draft budget, maybe sometime in March. I'm not 100% sure on that. And then there would be an ordinance presenting the budget numbers that would be considered for city council approval in April. And then the actual budget document itself would be either done right before that time or around the same time as the budget was being approved at that evening. That's what I think is the most recent history that I can gather.
I mean, I don't want to put people on the spot, but is it similar to what Ed, Ron, David?
What I would say right now is what Bill was saying back prior to when we did it the way he's suggesting, is that we had line items for every single item you can imagine that we went through. It was detailed, but the timeline was more like maybe late January, but it was the first quarter was our timeline basically. But it was detailed. I mean, I remember going, that's when we cut Christmas lights. I mean, we were cutting everything you can imagine back then. That was around 2010 when things went bad, but I thought it was a good process. I will say real quickly, not to interrupt, you were speaking, was that this was very informative, very segmented. I liked the way it was by department as well, so I got a lot out of it.
Any other?
Can you go back to the bar graph slide?
Which one?
It's way in the beginning. So if you look at 22, 23 compared to what you guys are forecasting for 25 and 26, so the police department's up 22%, fire's up 17, right? So you're almost at 35, 40% for two public safety. Can you talk a little bit about what's driving that expense for those two departments? And I just picked those two out because.
Are you just talking about police and fire?
You can go down, you can talk police, fire, public works, you can talk about, what's driving those.
I think earlier I mentioned, so personnel costs are roughly 67% of total general fund expenditures. On the police and fire side, it's probably closer to 70, 75. I don't have the number in front of me, but because there's fewer contracted services in those departments, the percentage of the budget related to personnel costs is a lot higher. So again, staffing levels, contracted labor contract raises, things negotiated with those collective bargaining units, those are the primary cost drivers associated with those departments. In addition to pension contributions, those pension contributions that we levy for actually get expensed in those departments as those contributions are being made. So those pension contributions we talked about being funded with property tax revenue, those are part of and a line item in those individual department budgets as well. And that's just governmental accounting rules that we have to follow.
Yeah, so I mean, just quick math. If you look at police, fire, public works from 22, 23 to 25, you're talking about 22, 17, 18% being driven largely by personnel costs and some of these other things. So if you can't maintain, what's the alternative if you choose to not fund? If you choose to say, well, that's too rich for us, we can't do that.
I don't think it's that simple because most of our employee base is represented by collective bargaining agreements, and I don't want to overstep. Jen, I'll let you jump in here if you want, but we're not going to get zeros on contracts. That's not going to be sustained. So we will be in violation of our collective bargaining agreements essentially. So it's not as simplistic as saying we're going to stop increasing our personnel costs because, health insurance, pensions, and salaries, those are the drivers.
I guess, could I just jump on that question? During COVID, didn't we have a flat line for like a year or two where it was 0%?
I asked this question before, and I think there was not. There was one single year, I think maybe non-union members took a 0%. Was that correct, Jen?
I could be wrong.
I don't remember about non-union, but there was no wage increases for any of the union contractors negotiating in the middle of COVID.
Right.
There were no wage. I think there maybe going back.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was thinking 2009, 10 recession. Yeah.
I thought there was a point where for at least a year or two, we were pretty flat, if not
I think there was a single year that I recall, but we can double check that and verify, but it was just one single year in the last decade plus.
Yeah, gotcha. Thank you.
If I can just refer to Ed real quick.
Sure.
Ed's right. We had 1 year where we didn't have, the unions, I believe, accepted a freeze, right?
Was it back in 10 then? Yeah.
All right, 15.
They'll check.
Go ahead, Brian.
What is the situation with the grocery tax? Is that going to impact this upcoming budget, or is that next year?
So that elimination of that tax as of January 1st of 2026, the impact for this upcoming fiscal year budget, we took that into account, and that actually did depress, some of our revenue considerations a little bit, but really the full impact would be that following fiscal year.
Any other questions right now? Go ahead, Jamie.
I had a couple of questions. So I can see that there are some projects that were, you showed some that were taken out. I guess I'm trying to understand, are you able to talk about some areas where reductions were made in the budget, like certain line items that were cut or specific projects that were removed, or, were there just forecasted budgets that were adjusted to make more realistic numbers? Can you help us understand so we can speak to that when we're discussing this with our residents?
Sure. These are some of the capital projects specifically that we've referred to, and I know that there were other smaller line item details. When we started the budget this year, we were at a 1.3 1.3?
It varies, but 1.2, 1.3.
$1.3 million deficit that we were looking to get under. So some of those were some of these like smaller capital projects, for example, sometimes things that would fall within our operational budgets, like this drainage site work at the History Museum, for example. So these are the bigger picture things, minus some smaller items that we were working to get out of the budget to do that.
Okay.
So these are the high-level ones that I think were more relevant to City Council. Reducing things like looking at our legal fees and are we actually expending these out where we may have some cushion for grievances or arbitrations and things like that, and really fine-tuning those a little bit more were some of the additional places that we made up that difference.
So not just taking out large chunks like this, you actually are looking at individual items. Do we need to have this item in there, or?
Correct, and we did that with each department, would go through every line item looking at, do we have variances, do we have money that's not being spent, are we over budget on certain things, and are certain projects necessary? A lot of our budget really is, when you look at it line by line, contractual services and things that roll over year to year that are just necessary for operations. So there isn't a whole lot of gray area in terms of things that we can just cut out and reduce in our budgets. So we did look at those things that were extraneous costs that were not critical to our day-to-day operations.
Okay, thank you so much.
Go ahead, David.
No, I appreciate that question too. I was going to ask that. I don't need like details like are we cutting on paper or anything, but you did look at those, so that's great. And I appreciate the staff doing this. It's hard, 100%. But when are we going to talk about revenues, potential new revenues after the budget's been passed?
Yeah, I think so for this year, because anytime we implement a new revenue source, obviously there's usually some time to actually start collecting that. So if it is something, as we talk about getting into that strategic plan update, if council wants us to focus as a staff on additional revenue sources and presentations on options, that's something we can absolutely do.
I mean, I can't speak for everybody here. I would welcome that too after May.
Sure,
of course.
And I think I really appreciate that feedback, only because, we're trying to help council to understand the full picture of our financial situation. And it's not that we don't want to recommend these projects as staff, but obviously the revenue is what the revenue is. So if we're willing to consider alternate revenue sources, and I know that when I first started, we went over some of those options, but I think we can definitely present a breadth of options that City Council can consider, and those impacts to both residents as well as visitors to the city, and increasing our revenue sources so we can do some of these projects.
And just one more. No, I appreciate that, and we don't have to get into details and discuss any of that now. One question, though, regarding kind of touching upon revenue is, and Bill, this is for you. How often do we refinance bonds and other things? And is that an option to refinance and take that savings? And
Sure. Yeah, it's always an option. There were a lot of bond issuances that were refinanced back in 2019, 20, 21, when rates were really low. So I work with our consultant regularly, and she sends me updates if there's outstanding bond issuance out there that could be refinanced. She lets me know. We talk about the net present value savings if we do it versus the cost. But right now, there really isn't anything substantive out there, especially with rates being where they are right now, being 5-6%. It's just not really possible right now. Yeah.
But you're on it, so that's good. Okay.
Yeah, that's something I'm in communication with her practically almost quarterly. So, yep.
Go ahead.
I think this one's for both of you, actually. Bill, you mentioned full-time employees at 289. It seemed like going through this budget, there was departments that were pretty consistent over the last 3 years, I want to say, from what I saw, unless I'm off a little bit there. But my question is more status quo budgets in regards to that. Do you feel that the departments are operating more efficiently now? Is demand a little less? Is it about the same? Or are we still trying to, not cut, but move some of that funding to more important things?
I'm going to step in only here because philosophically, from a budget perspective, I know that when I came in, set the tone with the department directors that we're not creating fluff in budgets. If you're not spending money, we're going to draw it down. If you need it for a project, let's make sure that we have the money available where we actually need to spend it, rather than this idea of if you don't use it, you lose it. So I do think that all of them have done a great job at saying, I don't need this year, or this isn't something I'm using now, let's put it somewhere else, knowing that if there is truly a need in the following fiscal year, that we can accommodate that and shift things around. So looking at it more comprehensively rather than all the departments essentially being separate operational budgets.
Gotcha, thank you. And then the other question I had was regarding your point, Bill, on the electric fund. Thank you for bringing that up, because I do remember that. That was like a whole restructure of that fund to the point where it's at now. It's obviously driving itself and it's successful. And we don't have to have the answer tonight, but how do we get there with these other funds, meaning water and sewer?
That's a great question. I think, like you alluded to, I think there were some structural rate changes on the electric side, probably about 10, 12 years ago, and that kind of set it on its path to getting out of a negative deficit position to where it's at right now. And so I think there's been probably some consistency on the expense side in terms of necessary capital improvements and things being pretty stable overall. So I think there's a combination of those two things are primarily what got it to where it's at right now.
So it's more about just doing it at some point, and then hopefully it'll take itself off.
Get on its path.
And one of the crucial pieces of that is finalizing our rate study, knowing what capital improvements we have coming down the pipeline and how we're going to finance those. So having a comprehensive view of an outlay of 5 to 10 years of what our capital needs are and understanding how we incorporate that into our rate structure and then following it is going to be the key piece in that.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead, Paul.
Actually, we just hit it, because I was going to go into, can you highlight some of the deficiencies that we're covering with loans from other funds, and how do we get in a spot, like, with just so we don't have to take a look at it in the future? I mean, yes, we have some projects that we're debt financing, borrowing from ourselves to do it, but we do need to highlight and understand that, we have places that we're doing rate studies, what we hope to get out of it, and how, is this, taking a look at it, highlighting that this was critically unfunded and what is happening, so we're not in this spot. Because I feel like we're a little lucky right now that we had access in other funds. Can you speak to that a little bit and make sure that we understand that the fund transfers, how we're using it, and really why we're needing to do that and how we're going to take care of that in the future? Do you get my question?
I'll start talking and Bill can catch up here. So I think that that's not free money that we're getting from electric. We're not just like we're transferring general fund revenues into our water sewer fund. That's not money we have to pay back. With the electric fund it is, because of those being enterprise funds. So right now it's a way to offset some of the capital needs that we have, and the costs that we're incurring with that money will have to be paid back, in addition to the other capital projects that we're going to be incurring. So we are going to have to make sure that when our rate study comes out, that it comprehensively looks at all of those costs, so we know exactly what dollars we need coming in to fund those projects.
I guess succinctly. So right now, the way that we're built, our rate structure it does not handle.
It does not, and that has been, we had a rate study in place. That rate study did expired. I don't even think that rate study necessarily captured all of the needs that we had, like replacement of our meters, for example, and that is a capital outlay item. Water main, correct, our water main replacement, thank you. It did not cover some of those items, so we were not looking at it necessarily comprehensively, only in terms of the big picture capital items we had. So this rate study, as we encounter it, is going to give us a much better picture of 100% of our capital needs and going into it with that idea. So we really have that knowledge to make those decisions about what we're going to do moving forward, and then a recommendation about the rates that are necessary to effectuate those.
I just want to make sure that I completely understand this is kind of an emergency Band-Aid and really isn't sustainable.
Yeah, I think over the last couple of years, Bill's done a great job with his staff of finding, I think we've talked about creative solutions. We've been reducing our general fund balance. We've been transferring money over from our general fund. We've been keeping at least quasi-pace with our rates by having that 5% increase in place, which is not enough, but it's at least allowing us to compound some of those rates. So, yes, we are at a point where we've done all the things that we can do to move some money around to make sure that we're still able to tackle critical projects, but we are not going to be able to continue doing that.
Thank you. Mark, go ahead.
Alderman Petrillo brought up the idea of new revenue sources. Blindly, what could that look like?
Go ahead. I mean, there are some options out there. We talked about having sort of a finance type meeting after the new fiscal year. You can call it a quarterly update, whatever it might be. So kind of a circle back and regroup on some of the big picture topics, and maybe kind of using that as a point to have some more discussion about finance and some dialogue about kind of where we're at come May, and then we can kind of branch off from there and start having some of those conversations potentially.
I guess I'm looking for like an example.
So user fees and taxes are the two buckets that you're probably looking at. So there's ways to impact mostly visitors and people that are coming into town, something like increasing, like we did 2 years ago to fund our road program, and increase in our home rule sales tax. That's always an option on the table.
Okay.
There are other taxes similar to that we could implement or incorporate. MFT tax is one of the ones that I know City Council tackled a few years ago. Alcohol tax was one. Things like that. There are other options either via increases in those or similar type use taxes.
Okay, but mainly increases are what's going to help us do the funding down the road. Okay, thank you.
Go ahead, David.
No, I'm sorry, you answered. I was just, as I recall, when it was a hard conversation. I think you even proposed like a natural gas tax, which I'm not in favor of, but, so that's an example. Like,
Yeah, I was just out of my own curiosity, I'm like, where are we getting?
Yeah, I
new
wanted to
revenue
provide
sources?
ones that we've used versus ones that are potentially on the table. Just,
Right.
I don't want to incite any frustration or upset, but those are some of the things that we've done previously, and they would be in similar nature to those things.
Okay, so all those help along with the property tax levy helps, all those things help.
Sure, and I think one that we've got currently floating on the table that I think two of the alderpersons asked about tonight is that use tax, that penny push tax on the gambling devices. That's another example of one.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead, Brian.
So looking at the screen, I see where it says in the bottom, needs, priorities, and then on the left side, it's capital projects held off on. In one of them, I think that's not in here, is the remodeling of this chamber for $1.3 million. You know, so I look at what can we do for, no, can you stay on that page?
it's in there. It's right there.
Yeah.
It's on that slide.
So for 1.3 million, so, you know, I guess priorities, is it this elected body that's going to sit down before this is finalized and determine, you know what, maybe the chamber's not the priority, maybe the parking deck is the priority, or maybe part remodel of this, you know what I'm saying? So I feel like this is fine to kind of like have an idea of what staff is recommending, but I think we need to have that discussion too.
Sure.
To determine what is the priority for us, because I'm looking at this and I see what 1.3 million can cover a lot of projects on the left side. So I'm just throwing that out there. I don't need to get in a deep conversation, but we will have that conversation in April then, is that?
So every time that a project is brought before City Council, for example, council chamber renovation, if we bring that before City Council, bids are favorable and it makes sense at that time to do it and council approves it, we move forward. If not, that frees up that money for something else to have that discussion about as well. And part of the drive for that one was specifically that it met some of the strategic plan goals, especially in light of a handful of complaints we've actually received about ADA access in this particular room. So that was the driver for that.
And I think there's maybe some merit to that, and maybe some of those issues can be resolved. But if there's 1.3 million, maybe it's phased in over a period of time. But I think that's for us to have that conversation to determine what we feel is a priority, you know, with these capital projects, and I'd like to have that conversation in April.
And some of that was targeted at the January workshop that we had discussing some of those capital needs and asking for feedback from that as well. So if there are items that any council member feels, hey, we really want to take a look at this, then we can always bring that back as well.
Well, thank you very much for the presentation. One thing I would encourage, obviously, we're going to be discussing this again on April 7th. So if you have questions between now and then, please get them to Director Hannah. When he comes back in front of us again, he has time to research and answer any of the questions that you do have. So thank you very much, Director Hannah.
And just for quick clarification, that April 7th meeting is if there are questions to follow up on or anything that we as staff need to address. If we don't hear anything, then we would move forward with the draft budget presentation to be approved on that April 17th meeting.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Director Hannah. All righty, there is no action needed on that. Next up, we have item 6E. We have Acting Chief Majewski to present. You have the floor.
Thank you, Alderman Weber. Item 6E is an amendment to the ordinance for the application requirement. City is now using an online licensing application called SmartGov, where business can fill out and submit forms via payment via the portal, so there's no hard copy applications for liquor, so that's been updated with this system. So with this new system, credit card payment is now available, where it wasn't before. We required a check or cash, so we just wanted to update the language to say that we're collecting all forms of payment. This amendment removes the language that was specified the previous payment process. This matter was brought to the LCC earlier today and was unanimously approved. So I'm just looking for a recommendation to remove the language to kind of update our payment system for licensing.
Any questions for that? Go ahead, Ron.
Thank you. I got two questions. My first question is, with the credit card, are we charging the applicant 3% or whatever we would charge?
I'm not sure about that.
That's what I was looking at kind of Heather over there.
Yes, it is. It is a pass-through for us so that we don't absorb those fees.
Okay, thank you. And then my second question is, what happens if the applicant disputes the charge? How does that affect everything? What if they say, I don't want to pay it?
There would be a process for that we'd have, an ability to say they pled guilty, whatever the citation is.
Okay.
So we would go through any credit card process. So if we have those issues and encounter those issues, we can let you know, but I don't foresee that should be an issue.
Okay, thank you.
Is there any more questions?
Second.
Moved by Lencioni, seconded by Bongard. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay. The ayes have it. That item is approved. Moving along, Chief Majewski is going to be up here for a minute because he has multiple items. So go ahead and present 6F.
6F is a amendment to the D10. Again, this was brought to the LCC earlier today and was approved unanimously. This amendment will redefine the D10 liquor license classification by removing museum as one of the venue types for this license. We had a museum in September, I believe, to the D10, but we want to remove the museum caveat. This change is being requested in order to accommodate the following items on the agenda, which will be the new D14 license classification. So looking for a recommendation to remove.
Any questions on this item? No?
Go ahead. I need some clarity because you're removing this in order to create a new license. Is that the purpose of this?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to abstain from this because I want more information on the new license we're creating before I can vote on this issue. Because I'm not going to remove it not knowing what I'm approving with the new license. I need to know what I'm approving. This is kind of like a preempt to approve something.
Can we table this and talk about the other item and then come back to it?
Yes, we could.
So D14, talk about D14 and then come back to D10. Is this kind of, we discussed this a bit at LCC too.
We just got to change the flow.
Right.
Hold on a second.
I'm sorry.
Can we rearrange the agenda to adjust the flow so we can circle back on this?
Has there been a motion on this one yet?
No.
No, then you can rearrange the agenda.
All righty. So with that being said, I need to take, the next item I need to take is I would be the, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe 6I would be the one that needs to happen first. Is that correct?
No, we'll do 6G because that's the new classification for D14.
Oh, okay.
And then if you want to go to 6I, because then that kind of leads into why the D14 classification. So I'll go with 6G. All
Yes.
right. So this amendment is a precursor to the 6I on the agenda and is requested pursuant to a new business concept being proposed. This amendment is necessary to codify the retail sale and consumption on premise of a museum into the newly created D14 liquor license classification. So both the retail sale and consumption on premise are ancillary to entertainment services and account for no more than 10% of the square footage of the business. Now, we do need to update the language on this. So basically the concept is this, and it's for 6I, which is the Moto Art Bar, 1300 block of East Main. So this is a museum where you can attend and pay for the services to visit the museum and purchase alcohol while you're visiting the museum. What this D14 will also do is not only can you purchase the alcohol to consume while you're at the museum, but the specially labeled and specially made alcohol can then be purchased, packaged to take off site. So the thought is that the the patrons visit the museum, drink the craft wine that's specifically made for that business, and then if they choose to, they can buy a brand-new bottle, packaged bottle, to then take home. And again, I can talk about that more into 6I, but the specific alcohol that will be purchased for off-site consumption is specific to that business. It cannot be purchased anywhere else. It's specifically made and labeled by that business. The business does sell other alcohol, but that other alcohol, other wines or other beer, they're not selling that to take. It's only the specific version of this alcohol.
That makes sense. Is there any questions for 6G then?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So if somebody walks into this museum, they can't go in there and buy a six-pack of old style and walk out the door?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
That's all I want to know. Thank you.
Yes, and I would add too that to purchase any alcohol to leave package, you would have to purchase the ancillary to visiting the museum.
Yeah, I just want to make sure we're not turning it into a liquor store where they're going and buying things like a Lundin's or 7-Eleven or something. That's all. Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Go ahead, David.
So, yeah, just a little context from, as a member of the Liquor Commission. So we talked about this, and that's where the language change came in, because there's a fee. I asked the question, similarly, like, can I be driving down 64, go in and buy the alcohol, just, instead of going all the way to Binny's or whatever, I'm going to go to the museum and buy a bottle of wine. Can't do that because it has to be tied to being a patron of the museum.
That's correct.
And so there's a fee, which is, I think, a barrier to people just going in and leaving. But then also we changed the language per Nick's suggestion to make it official that you cannot just drive by, grab wine, and leave.
Yes.
So
could Nick speak to that?
Sure. So David's right. Earlier at the meeting, once we heard what the operational plan is from the applicant, we're going to be cleaning up the language so that the off-premises sale is ancillary to the museum event, which, as we indicated, involves buying a ticket to get in. The comment you made is exactly what we discussed, that this isn't meant to be a package sale. You can walk in, grab a six-pack, and leave. So when you're in there, there's a 10% opportunity of area to buy this craft wine that they've been talking about. So there is some slight language change to what you've seen in your pack that'll come back to you by the ordinance to account for that.
And it is craft wine, and they have their own labels emblazed on, they're beautiful bottles, motorcycle-type images. So.
Okay, I'm fine.
Any other questions for 6G? So I'm looking for go ahead, Ron.
Real quick one, could this be a problem to enforce this? How is it going to know what you're buying there? That's my only...
Well,
I'm okay with it. I'm just throwing that out there.
I'm not going to speak for the enforcement arm of our city, but like we do with all our other liquor licenses, we occasionally engage in compliance.
Compliance check.
And if Nick wants to walk in and buy a six-pack and walk out, there'll be a violation in front of liquor control, and he puts his license at risk.
But this is a little different because you can buy this alcohol, but not this alcohol. Versus a liquor store, you can buy anything if it's illegal. That's all. I'm just throwing that out there.
Go ahead, Mr. Lencioni.
Considering we're talking about, specialty labeled alcohol, if there was something else it seems like it would be one of the easiest liquor licenses to actually enforce, because you would hear about it if something other than that was being sold.
Yes.
News travels pretty quickly around here.
Yes.
So you feel pretty comfortable that this will be an easy place
I do, and the point is, obviously, in this wine is specifically labeled and made for that business, and you can only buy it there, so...
I trust your judgment.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Motion by Bongard, seconded by Folks. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay. That is approved. We are now going to move along to item 6I. Go ahead, Chief Majewski.
Considering the above, the Moto Art Bar, Inc., DBA St.Charles Motorcycle Museum and Art Gallery was originally provided a D10 liquor license back in September. This allowed the business to offer alcoholic beverages on premise ancillary to their entertainment services museum visit. As an added feature of their service, the alcohol wine they sell is specifically created and labeled for their business. The background packet provided included the original background of the D10 that we did in September, and then an addendum that we did to accommodate the D14, specifically measuring to make sure that the area where the alcohol is being sold is less than 10% of the total square footage of the business. This matter was also heard before the LCC and was approved.
Yes, thank you very much.
Second.
Any questions? Motion by Wirball, seconded by Lencioni. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay. The ayes have it. Thank you very much. 6I is approved. Now we can go back to 6F.
6F is then the D10, specifically just to take out the word museum from the D10.
Is there any questions for 6F?
Move for approval.
Second.
Motion by Wirball, seconded by Petrillo. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay. The ayes have it. 6I is, I'm sorry, 6, is it H? No, I can't even see it anymore. H-I? No, it's I. Help me out here. F.
No, F.
Sorry. I have all kind of scribbles on my paper. I'm trying to keep everything in order.
Me too.
All right, so now, we can now move to item 6H.
6H.
Yes.
This also appeared earlier this evening at the Liquor Control Commission and advanced with the unanimous recommendation. The late-night permits were reviewed by my staff and I, along with other city departments, to review any outstanding issues, safety violations, or debts. We have 26 late-night permits, 16 of which will be Class B, which are restaurant licenses, and 10 of which are C, or tavern licenses. Of the 26 late-night permit applications, 12 would like to stay open until 1 a.m. and 14 would like to stay open until 2 a.m. We have a total of 246 city licenses, and the city has a good rapport, communication, outreach with all our local license holders. There was one violation of these 26. There was only one business that had a violation that was in front of the Liquor Control Commission in 2024, which was Liquor and Wine. In November, they were fined and paid their fine without issue, so no other violations as far as that's concerned. With that, I recommend approval for the 26 late-night permits, and I can answer any questions if you have.
Any questions for item 6H? Seeing none, I'm looking for a motion in a second. Moved by Lencioni, seconded by?
Second.
Second by Wirball. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay. All right, 6H is approved. We are now moving along to 6J.
6J is reference to the Mother's Day 5K, which was originally approved in January, but under the incorrect date of Sunday, actual Mother's Day. The event is actually on Saturday, the day before. Correct date is Saturday, May 10th. No other changes other than the date is being made to the event, so it's just moving the date to Saturday, not Sunday.
Is there any questions for 6J?
Motion to approve.
Motion by Munns. Seconded by Folks. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay. Ayes have it. 6J is approved. Thank you very much, Chief Majewski.
Thank you.
Next up, we have item 7A. Director Gunderson's going to speak to it. You have the floor.
Thank you, Chairman Weber. Yes, so the item I have for the committee tonight is for the annual renewal of our subscription to SnapLogic integration software. This cloud-based software allows us to automate the integration of data between different applications. For example, between a utility billing system, we take customer data and we can automatically integrate it to our utility billing mailing provider. It's all done automatically through the SnapLogic platform. So that will answer any questions you may have.
Any questions for Director Gunderson? Seeing none, looking for a motion and second. Moved by Wirball, seconded by Petrillo. Roll call, please.
Kulkaitis.
Yes.
Folks.
Yes.
Bungard.
Yes.
Munns.
Yes.
Lencioni.
Yes.
Petrillo.
Yes.
Wirball.
Yes.
Fessner.
Yes.
All right, great. That motion carries. Thank you very much, Director Gunderson. Next up, we have Derek Conley, the Economic Development Director for item 8A. You have the floor.
Yes, this is an ordinance amending Title 10, Vehicles and Traffic, but to put this in plain English, this would be updating our regulation on bicycles and their use in St. Charles. So this really started when we started getting complaints last year about e-bikes on our sidewalks. We've gotten more and more complaints. E-bikes are becoming more and more popular and kind of being a little bit of a hazard to our pedestrians. So this does look at all of our bicycle regulations, but then specifically calls out e-bikes. So I won't go through all of the little changes that have been put in here one by one, but I would just call them a lot of common sense safety regulations. So things like no hazardous behavior, no riding on the back of fenders, and of course of fenders, and also yielding to pedestrians, things like that. There are two big changes that I would say. The first one is prohibiting the use of any type of bicycle, not just e-bikes, but any type of bicycle in our downtown overlay district. So this is kind of the core business district in our downtown. Truth be told, we actually have a lot of signs in our downtown already that say that you're not allowed to use bicycles, but this has actually not been codified. So this ordinance would actually codify that and saying in the downtown overlay district, you are not allowed to use any bicycles. I have walked the downtown and found some other locations where I'd like to add additional signage that needs to be in place just so people can see that and realize. We do have bike paths in our downtown, or we have the Sharrows around. You can continue to use the Sharrows on the road, which would be appropriate. If you don't feel comfortable with that, then the appropriate decision would be to dismount your bike and then walk it until you leave the downtown area. The other change is specific to e-bikes. So we are getting a lot of complaints about these on the sidewalks, and this ordinance would basically prohibit any use of the e-bikes on our sidewalks, and that goes for anywhere in the city. And with that, I can take any questions.
Go ahead, Jamie.
I'm curious about enforcement and, I guess, what the penalties are for breaking these rules.
Yeah, this was crafted with the help of the police department. They did reach out to other municipalities and kind of get some guidance from them that had already implemented things like this. There would be a violation if someone broke any of the rules and regulations in here. It would be $50 for an offender, and they would need to be paid in 14 days. If not, then it was increased to $75. I think our police department realizes that this is an issue and do plan on enforcing it, and I think there are particular parts of the city where we know that this is a common occurrence.
Go ahead, Paul.
I guess that was my real question was genuinely how or what is a plan for reinforcement of something like that, or enforcement?
I guess I think we realize kind of where this is happening and notifying our police officers that this is an issue. I mean, just to be blunt, I think the biggest partner downtown is over here on Riverside, where there's way too narrow sidewalks, way too many impediments in the way or poles. And that is an area where I think that I would ask our police officers to kind of look at first so that people are abiding by the rules, and if they're not, then issuing violations.
Alderperson Munns, I think this is also speaking a little bit more to, as our traffic congestion and visitors increase in downtown, re-strategizing about how we are looking at enforcement of a breadth of things down there, not just the bicycles, but parking issues as well. So it's something that I think that moving forward that the police department and I will be having discussions about.
Okay, thank you. Because I think my larger question is, how are you enforcing something like that from a vehicle, which is where we see most of our police enforcement come from.
Correct,
So
and it's going to be, like I said, a oh my gosh.
Re-strategization.
You got what I'm trying to say. Yes, exactly.
You.
And reevaluating how we've been doing things, and maybe that comes with a little bit of a tweaking of our current enforcement mechanisms and looking at alternates.
Okay, thank you both. Appreciate it.
Go ahead, Paul.
So I want to ask and make sure that I understand, because there was a lot of concern about this on Dean Street. We had a lot of talk with residents about e-bikes on sidewalks. So there is a prohibition of e-bikes on sidewalks? It is a complete prohibition?
Correct.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I can speak to a little bit more, I guess. We did look at other municipalities, and this is becoming more and more common. So we did reach out to some of those municipalities. A lot of them have actually implemented electric scooters be prohibited on sidewalks also for a similar problem, but those have been around a lot longer. E-bikes, which are relatively new, you're starting to see more and more municipalities implement this rule because it has become a hazard.
Right. I'm just thinking about it. I mean, if this is what everybody's doing, I definitely get that. I'm concerned about the overall, I mean, there is an element of judgment that comes with this, because you have an e-bike that's turned off, and yes, it's an e-bike, but, somebody fights like, well, I guess if you're saying that you cannot use an e-bike on the sidewalk, then I guess that's the best. Okay, I'm just thinking through it. But I mean, if somebody was using an e-bike without the electronic motor turned on, and they're going at, a pedestrian speed, that's a whole different ballgame, but it's still prohibited.
So that was considered, and I think it was Evanston. They do allow for Class 1 and Class 2 to be used on sidewalks, and then you can use a Class 3, but it has to be disengaged. What we ran into of why we didn't want to go down that path is it's impossible from an enforcement standpoint if you see an e-bike going down the sidewalk. Of course, you can see how fast they're going. Maybe they're going too fast, but whether that motor is engaged or not is kind of impossible to tell.
Yeah, but there's also language about, reckless operation and things like that.
Oh, I'm sorry, say that again?
I think as you were talking about, there is language and other statutes in there about, reckless operation.
Yeah.
So, okay.
Go ahead, Brian.
Thanks for putting this together, because I got a lot of complaints from seniors downtown on Main Street. It's a public safety issue. So my question is, are you going to have some additional signage that includes e-bikes? Because I know it says bikes now, but are you going to update that to include?
Yeah, we can update that to include e-bikes. Yeah.
Thank you.
So Derek, you said that low-speed scooters are a part of that as well?
Yeah, they would be included in this ordinance too. They would apply.
So like one of Ryan's 4 kids, if they were on a scooter on the sidewalk, they would get in trouble?
They would never be. Probably only one of them that would do it though.
If it was a motorized scooter.
Motorized.
Motorized. So yeah, if it's
jokes on you, we don't have those.
Is there any other questions on this? Go ahead,
I
Jean.
actually do. So I actually am curious about that. So we have these, those Razor scooters that are motorized, and you can be fairly young using those. So we're asking those kids, maybe 7, 8, 9, to be in the street?
Yeah, I can do a little bit more research on that. Well, I'm not asking them to be in the street, but I
guess that is my question.
But, yeah,
that is what our expectation would be that they are in the street as opposed to on a sidewalk.
I think the intent of what we're going for is that you do have some scooters that are really souped up that honestly you see teenagers or adults even using, and those are kind of hazardous. I think that, we're not really targeting maybe the 8-year-old that has kind of a really low-powered one. I can look and do a little research to see if there's different classes like there are e-bikes.
Yeah.
Because, it's not the intent to do that.
Go ahead, Paul, you have another question?
Yeah, I'm just thinking with Jamie, and I'm comfortable with where it's at right now, but I do anticipate as more people have e-bikes, you get a call, somebody's mad at somebody, they're like, there was an e-bike on the street. But I guess we can fix that as we better understand how it's enforced, and at least we're protecting people right now.
Yeah, I think e-bikes are going to become more and more popular, and I think we are kind of on the front end of this, and as they become more popular, you're going to see more issues in other municipalities, and we will more than likely have to adjust this policy.
I would say that I think that we're at a good starting spot, and as we understand it, we'll be back here talking about this more and more as we go forward.
Go ahead, Judy.
I just want to add one more thing. So as we look back about a half an hour or so, and we look back at some budgetary conversations where we're going to defer some pedestrian bike infrastructure work, we're not going to be necessarily keeping up as a city with the things that we want to do to protect those cyclists and pedestrians and, scooter people. So I think we should definitely keep those things in mind as we make ordinances. If we are pushing people into the street and we're not necessarily protecting them, these are things we want to make sure are considerations. Because paint is not protection. These are still people that are going to be navigating vehicles. And if we are dealing with enforcement issues as far as speeding, we are not lowering speed limits, we're not really mitigating the concerns of people versus vehicles, we're going to have to be very careful what we're asking people to do with these different types of modalities, because they are going to continue to increase, and we're going to have these all encountering each other all over the city. So I just want to make sure that we as a body are aware of that, and that we're taking responsibility for that in these ordinances.
Okay.
Go ahead, Ryan.
Did you say that you're talking to the Park District as well?
We have notified them of this. I know that they've had similar complaints.
Yeah, so that I think that the majority of complaints that we get in the second ward are tied to Fox Chase Park and a couple of the other parks with kids on e-bikes zipping around, and so obviously they're coming from the park, then they're on the sidewalk, then they're on the street, then they're back into the park. So however you can work that into this.
plan.
Yeah, so I think this would only apply to our city sidewalks, and,
Yeah.
you know, I think the park district, they have their own rules individually by park on whether it's bikeable or not.
That's a problem.
Any other questions?
Move for approval?
Second. I have a motion by Wirball, seconded by Lencioni. Roll call, please.
Kulturitis.
Yes.
Folks.
Yes.
Bungard.
Yes.
Munns.
Yes.
Lencioni.
Yes.
Kim. Oh, I'm sorry, Petrola.
Yes.
Wirball.
Yes.
Esner.
Yes.
All right, that motion carries. Thank you very much. Next up, we have public comment. Anyone here for public comment? Anyone online for public comment? I do not see any. Any additional items from mayor, council, or staff? No. No need for an executive session. I need a motion and a second to adjourn. Moved by Folks, seconded by Lencioni. All those in favor of adjourning, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, say nay. The meeting is adjourned. Thank you.
I guess for an hour.